back to the Formed Book Club. We continue to discuss Robert Reilly's book, America on Trial in Defense of the Founding. This is Father Fessio here in San Francisco at the Office of Ignatius Press, joined by our senior editor, Vivian Dudro, who's nearby, and Joseph Pierce in South Carolina. We're going to take chapters 7 and 8, The Divine Right of Kings and Its Enemies, and John Locke, Problem or Solution. Just to kind of sum up what we've come through this far, the first two chapters, chapters 1 and 2, talk about the ancient legacy and the medieval development of it, of nature, the idea that God created the world according to the Logos, according to reason, and things have natures. And that means that in political society, each person has his own dignity. We're all equal before the Father. That is the root of consent of the governed, sovereignty of the people, representative government, the right to revolution. And these were all rooted in Athens, Jerusalem, and Rome, and then developed in the medieval period. That's chapters 1 and 2. Chapters 3 and 4 tell about the loss of that reason and the loss of nature, starting with William of Ockham and followed by Luther and others, that led to a conception of man that was nominalistic, that is, no real essence to man or society or anything, and therefore voluntaristic. There's no nature, there's no telos, there's no end, and will becomes dominant. Chapter 5, he shows how Richard Hooker, the Protestant divine, restored natural law. And then in 6 and 7, we see how Thomas Hobbes diverged further in the direction of voluntarism and nominalism, and therefore we got the rise of an absolute secular state. And then we come into today's two chapters, The Divine Right of Kings and Its Enemies, which was represented by James I of England and Robert Filmer, who was the apologist for this. And in chapter 8 is John Locke, who is a crucial figure. The big question is John Locke interpreted by the founders to be like Hobbes or to be like Bellarmine, Suarez, Aristotle, Aquinas, and so on? So we're going to jump into chapter 7, Divine Right of Kings and Its Enemies. I have some things to say, but I've already spoken quite a bit. So Joseph or Vivian, would you like to say anything?
I'll defer to the lady.
Well, I'd like to hear from Joseph, because I think this is a chapter that he probably has a lot to say about, since it touches on questions that he's dealing with in a book he's working on. So I thought I would give the floor to you, Joseph.
Well, thank you, Vivian. Well, I'll go in that case then to two quotes by Parliament, by the English Parliament, on pages 202 and 203 respectively, one of which I think illuminates the devil in the detail, and the other one I think is much better and actually illustrates the principle of subsidiarity. So on page 202, this is Parliament resisting James I's Divine Right of Kings with the Declaration of Polity for of the Commons, when they say there, the voice of the people in the things of their knowledge is as the voice of God. Now, that is potentially problematic because it suggests that ultimate sovereignty is with the people divorced from God. And certainly we have to understand that Parliament in 1604 was militantly Puritan and therefore de facto nominalistic. I mean, they are opposing the divine right of kings for pure matters of real politic, not because they of any principle. I mean, Robert Reilly is very good at discussing the principles, but I think that's important. But then 24 years later, Parliament is speaking much more common sense. So that indented quote in the middle of the page there on 203, if I may read it. Your subjects have inherited this freedom, that they should not be compelled to contribute to any tax not set by common consent in Parliament, that no free man may be taken or imprisoned or be dispossessed of his freehold or liberties or his free customs, or be outlawed or exiled or in any manner destroyed, but by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land, that no man of what estate or condition that he be should be put out of his land or tenements, nor taken, nor imprisoned, nor disinherited, nor put to death without being brought to answer by due process of law. Now that is brilliant, because that really is establishing the principle of subsidiarity, and whoever the absolute monarch is, whether it's a totalitarian dictator or a king, has no right to ride roughshod over these rights of individuals and families.
Yes, I'd like to go back to page 197, because as you know, Robert Reilly is very good at telling us what he's going to do and then giving us the evidence for what he's done. But about a quarter of the way down, a very lapidary expression, he says, as churches became national, kings became absolute. Therefore, the two orders of the state and the church became fused again, with the king being the one that wielded the only sword. Further down in the middle of the page, he says, we shall briefly examine James I's teachings, as well as those of Sir Robert Filmer, and then the most prominent reactions against them. So this is the idea that's going to justify the divine right of kings. I mean, James wanted it because he was king. Filmer wanted to support James. Then at the bottom of the page, he says, the criticisms of divine right by Locke and Sidney, Algernon Sidney, however, had been preceded by those of Italian Jesuit Robert Cardinal Bellarmine and Spanish Jesuit Francisco Suarez, two of the most powerful thinkers of the late 16th century and early 17th centuries. So it's interesting here. You have the result of Occam and Luther's revolution as it played out in England, with James I claiming the divine right and Filmer supporting him, but that there were objections to that, and the objections came post-medieval, if you want to say, slightly pre-enlightenment, by Bellarmine, Cardinal Bellarmine, and Francisco Suarez. It's a fascinating intellectual history, but in the outlines are so clear. That's what I like about it.
I might just add, Father, that someone might wonder, well, that seems odd that this is something developing in England, and it's getting this very robust critique from an Italian and a Spaniard. And, throughout this book, what we're getting sometimes are just, the most long-lasting examples of these thoughts that have been retained through time. And we don't sometimes realize how far spread they were or where else they got planted. But on page 197, up in the first paragraph, he explains that divine right was a product of the Reformation, seeking to substitute royal for papal spiritual authority, though Catholic monarchs, especially in France and Spain, were only too happy to join in.
Yes.
In other words, there were other monarchs besides that in England who were opportunistically seeing in this new train of thought a way to advance their own power. And so the reaction to it then also came from other quarters besides the English-speaking world. And but it's to your credit, Father, that two great Jesuits ended up being the banner carriers for this.
No, I'm proud of the Jesuit history, and especially what he points out is that it really had a role to play in the founding of America.
Yes.
Now, he does say in page 199, a new paragraph there, citing Bellarmine and Suarez is not meant to insinuate that Americans' origins were Catholic. Most of the founders were Protestant, after all, but the provenance of their ideas was ultimately Catholic in that they invoked natural law and natural rights to justify their cause. So, in a certain sense, the Jesuits helped carry on the Dominican tradition, which would farther back than that, to carry on the Greek and Roman tradition of natural law. And without this, we never would have come to the founding that we've experienced. Now, what I love, we'll see as we go forward here, is that I think he shows persuasively that the founding was not a revolution, a change brought about by Enlightenment principles, but rather it was a restoration of pre-Enlightenment principles.
Well, I have something 204, if I may.
Please.
Yeah, it's obviously it's a sin not to mention G.K. Chesterton in any book club, regardless of the topic. So in the middle of page 204, this is Reilly talking about what Filmer was advocating in defense of divine right of kings. That beginning of that paragraph there, his major point was that the king's authority is absolute because the father's authority is absolute, and the king is the father of his country. And that reminds me of that famous saying by Chesterton, one of my favorites: to say my country right or wrong is like saying my mother drunk or sober. Yeah. In other words, if your father is drunk, if your father's a tyrant, we do have a right to resist and correct your own father, right? He doesn't have an absolute right to abuse his children, to abuse anybody else. So even if we take that patriarchal understanding of things to the extreme that Filmer and James I were taking, which I don't, this still does not give them the right they claim.
But how could anybody accept that analogy or that comparison between the father of the family and the head of a state? Because the father of the family has minors, not yet adults, people who can't make decisions for themselves at the beginning. But are we going to say that all the citizens of a country are children compared to the leader?
And the Christian understanding of fatherhood is you lay down your life for your children. You don't kick them around and tell them what to do.
Vivian, any thoughts? No, that's okay.
Well, just on that thought of fatherhood, there is an understanding that every man in whatever role he plays in life has a sort of fatherliness to it, and same for a woman, a sort of motherliness to it. And so there's a way in which leaders are fatherly if they do it right, but it's in Filmer these outrageous quotes, and I can't find right now, where he takes this to this absurd extreme, right? So it's another one of those cases where something can have a kernel of truth to it, but when it's taken to an absurd conclusion.
Actually, Vivian, if I can give an example of that, page 206 towards the bottom, towards the top, talk about Filmer's chapter headings, and then the first chapter, that the first kings were fathers of families. Well, that may, if you become really primal and primitive about things, may be the case. But very quickly, the first kings started to actually kill and attack the next door family and take over the next door family and become the king of other people's families as well as their own family. In other words, realpolitik and Machiavellianism and just the power of the most ruthless quickly kicked in and had nothing to do with the fathers of family. It's about the strongest and the most ruthless. And that to me is so obvious that how can they be so simplistic as to make an argument based upon this?
But also this very ambiguous chapter title, because almost all kings have been fathers of families, including presidents of the United States have been fathers of families. It doesn't mean that the country is also part of your family.
Right.
That's right.
And I love, by the way, just next page there, Robert Bellarmine, his quote there, 3 lines down on 207. Kings will profit much to remember that the people over whom they rule are of the same kind and equality as they themselves. It is possible that not a few of their subjects be more prudent, capable, conscientious, and worthy of the crown than they themselves.
Yes. We're all adults here. To father's point, that a father is ruling over minors, right? I mean, my grown children, I don't rule over them anymore now that they're adults. So once we're all adults here, it's a different situation. And now we all need to be equal under the law, no matter who we are.
Another refreshing thing for me about delving into history like Reilly does here is to see that there are these brilliant aphoristic thoughts which are just as current now as they ever were then. I mean, it's not like we invented these ideas, that they're there already, expressed beautifully. In fact, expressed for the most part better than we could express them.
Mm-hmm.
I have something
Again, on
215.
on 210.
Go ahead.
Sorry, you say 215?
Yeah. Want to go ahead before that?
210, is that all right?
Yeah.
So again, I've got another quote from Robert Bellarmine here, which I think is excellent. About a third of the way down, page 210. A bad law is not a valid law. Good laws are not a curtailment of liberty, but a charter of every man's right. When laws do not protect men's rights, but infringe upon them, when laws are an impediment to the community's development and welfare, they are not good laws, and they are therefore not valid laws. So that is very interesting here. We need to bear in mind in the whole discussion of the divine right of kings or democracy or aristocracy, is that civil law is always subject to moral law, and that laws can be invalid even if the government or the king have brought them into being if they are actually contrary to moral law.
And it's very apropos because we have several laws in this land, United States, as the Constitution is interpreted, which are invalid, which are not laws.
Yeah.
A law that permits marriage between the same sex is not a law.
Right.
It's not valid.
Right. Or infanticide.
Yes. On 215 at the top, the examples of Bellarmine and Suarez also show that the fundamental principles of constitutional rule are not somehow fatally dependent on Enlightenment notions that are alien to them, since they preceded the Enlightenment. That's an important, really important point he makes in this book.
Yes.
We just can't say, oh, well, it was the dark ages, the Middle Ages, superstitious church, and so on. Finally, the Enlightenment came, and now we see all reason and light, and now we have this form of government which is based on the Enlightenment. Well, no. The French government was based on the Enlightenment. It was a disaster.
Yeah, yes. I mean, the misunderstanding and misconstruction is based upon the fact that John Locke is an Enlightenment philosopher.
Right.
But of course, as you know, nobody exists in a vacuum. Right. Locke is actually building upon what came before him. Is he rejecting Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, etc., or is he somehow building and changing them?
Yes.
Shall we move on?
By the way, I don't know about you, but I didn't know much about Suarez at all until I read this book.
Or me.
Well,
and I knew that Bellarmine had things to say about divine right and explaining why it wasn't validly Christian. But I have never, until this book, had it all spelled out so clearly what these two men, Bellarmine and Suarez, really had to say, and how even if there's not a direct link to the founders in quoting from them, that their lineage includes them and includes these stellar Catholic thinkers. This book has just been teaching me so much.
I mean, of course, I had heard of Suarez, being a Jesuit myself, but also very early on, Ignatius Press, we published a book whose title I forget now, by Alejandro Chafuin. It was basically on the 16th and 17th century Jesuit scholars on economics. And prior to the Enlightenment, you had the justification for the free market. It's fascinating that a lot of these fundamental economic principles, which many people accept today, were expressed so profoundly back there by these Jesuit theologians in Spain, of all places. So, should we move
Father Vivian, knowing what good sports you are, and this is an Englishman taking part in a book club on defending America, I hope you won't mind my just quoting something on page 222.
Please do.
This is just under the indented quote there towards the top. Like Hooker, Bellarmine, and Suarez, he thought that, quote, the best governments of the world have been composed of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. I would just suggest that maybe the present UK Constitution is closer to that than the American one.
Well,
well, actually, this too came from Aristotle, that the best government was actually going to be a combination.
Right.
Because each of these things can have these evil tendencies.
So it's checks and balances, basically. But the American Constitution, to be fair, has done its best to have those checks and balances. And
right,
I think that's what, monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, if they're working well together, that contains that checks and balances.
Right. So monarchy for the U.S. is the executive. Aristocracy is the Senate.
That's right.
And democracy is the House of Representatives. And actually, you could argue that we've gotten in worse and worse trouble as a nation the more we've become a pure democracy aided and abetted by an activist court. So that the worst mob rule instigators have been able to bring about such substantial changes in our society through this kind of process. And now, if we don't resort back to these principles yet again, look what's happening in our country right now. You've got...
but we do have to distinguish between democracy and the mob, because the mob's always a minority. It's just a very active one that scares people. And a real democracy is only actually going to survive if the majority have the courage to stand up to the mob.
Yes, well put. Well put.
And then you took the words out of my mouth, Vivian, but I will then add to them as a way of reconciling our two forms of government, Joseph. Monarchy does not necessarily mean a king. It means the rule of one. And so we have a monarchy here. It's just that every 4 years we elect a new monarch.
Yes.
And so I think the executive, and as you say, the bicameral legislature with the Senate, which is the aristocracy, so to speak, and then the House of Representatives, it's like the monarch in England plus the House of Lords and the House of Commons.
Yes.
I mean, we don't live in the best of all possible worlds, that's for sure. But I do think,
and the UK Constitution. Sorry,
the
UK Constitution is not perfect, and there's lots of things wrong with it. But I have argued that the present monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, had muscles she hasn't used. And the fact that she's not open to election every 4 years, on the one hand, she can't completely defy the will of Parliament and the will of the people because she'll just be deposed. On the other hand, if Parliament is defying the will of the people, which it's done often over the past 50 years, and the Queen takes the side of the people, Parliament has to step in line with majority rule. So in actual fact, the monarch could potentially have great democratic power. And she can't ride roughshod because that way, if Parliament and the people are against the Queen, she's had it. So it's actually quite a good checks and balances situation now.
Yes, if you notice, the monarchies that have managed to survive in the modern world are those that have parliamentary rule of some kind in their countries, right? There does seem to be an inherent stability when you combine these things together.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, let's go to chapter 8 in John Locke, because Locke is kind of the hinge.
Yes.
To take two hardware words, I suppose. A lock is a hinge. And the real question, well, actually, this is one of those chapters where Reilly makes it clear in the beginning what he's going to do. So 225, the first page of the chapter, he says, we've endeavored to show that there is a lineage from Aristotle, Aquinas, Hooker, and Sidney, influenced to a degree by Bellarmine and Suarez, from which the American founders' thoughts developed, heavily weighted towards the primacy of reason. Where does John Locke fit within this tradition? That's a good summary of what he's done. Middle of the page. Did the influence of Hobbes, through Locke's thinking, derail the American founding from the Christian and natural law tradition by steering it toward radical individualism and materialism? To put the question another way, was Locke a nominalist and a voluntarist, or was he a natural law realist? This is like Thomas Aquinas. He sets out the question. Now he's going to try and answer it. And on page, let's see here, 226, my last quote here, very top, the question at issue is not whether Locke's teachings could be put to disparate uses, but rather to what use the founders put them. So he admits Locke is ambiguous in some places, but how did the founders read and interpret and then, follow Locke? That's the key.
Yes, that's the key question. And I love it that he actually quotes the founders themselves.
Yes.
In placing Locke in this list of other thinkers that they relied on. And now so for example, on page 232, the American founders clearly saw Locke in the tradition we have been delineating. Jefferson and Adams explicitly placed him there. In 1825 letter to Henry Lee about the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson wrote, quote, "All its authority rests on the harmonizing sentiments of the day, whether expressed in conversation, in letters, in printed essays, or the elementary books of public right, as Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, Sidney, etc." And then he gives a similar quote from John Adams, whose list is Aristotle, Plato, Livy, Cicero, Sidney, Harrington, and Locke. So this key question, not what are the many ways Locke can be interpreted, but what use of him did the founders make of him?
And could I give a couple of quotes from Locke, which I would suspect do epitomize the use that the founders made of him. So I'm going back to page 228, 5 lines down. This is a quote by Locke. "For men, being all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise maker, all the servants of one sovereign master, sent into the world by his order and about his business, they are his property, whose workmanship they are, made to last during his not one another's pleasure." So one nation under God, right? And then 3 lines further down, this wonderful warning: "The taking away of God, even if only in thought, dissolves all."
Yes.
You remove God, you have nothing but anarchy.
And on those quotes that Vivian had recited here, it's clear that even grammatically, Locke is in a chain of references, that goes back to Aristotle. He's not rooted in some Enlightenment philosopher, but he goes back all the way. That's beautiful. In fact, as we can't avoid watching political activity in our own country today, but I wonder, after reading this book, are there any people who are seriously involved in politics or even in punditry who have the intellectual breadth, the depth, the wealth of knowledge and understanding that our founders had?
Yes.
I mean, can you?
No, we're dealing with ignorance, and that's the problem. Ignorance of history, ignorance of philosophy, ignorance of theology, and that's the problem. We are being run by barbarians who think they're civilized or they think they are progressed. One thing I would say,
they're woke. They're woke.
They're woke, exactly. They're woke. So ungrammatical as well. Middle of page 234. It's too long to read, but that whole paragraph I wanted to point out, 234 to 235. This is brilliant because this is Locke basically disowning Hobbes. This is Locke critiquing Hobbes in a negative fashion. So, the whole idea of trying to conflate Hobbes with Locke, well, what did Locke say about Hobbes? This is obviously the most pertinent evidence we want here, and it's damning. And that one paragraph really is all you need to know as regards Locke distancing himself from the nihilism of Hobbes.
Yes, and how apropos for these crazed woke utopians, this last sentence of Locke in that paragraph, quote, "He that thinks absolute power purifies men's bloods and corrects the basis of human nature need read but the history of this or any other age to be convinced of the contrary."
I know.
A knowledge of history, which the woke generation don't have. That's the problem.
That's right. That's right.
So, I didn't have many particular lines to cite in the rest of this chapter because the whole meaning of the chapter is is so beautifully expressed by everything he says there. Nothing really stood out to me, but clearly Locke is in the tradition of the great natural law scholars and thinkers of Western civilization. That's one thing. And number two, everybody will admit that Locke had a very substantial effect on the founding documents of America. So I think I don't know how you refute or dispute with Reilly on this, because as you say, Joseph, some of those quotes he has, I mean, that's all you need to prove your thesis.
Right. Unfortunately, though, there's other quotes from Locke that have been, used to interpret him in other ways. And Reilly does one by one take up the subject areas where that confusion has come from. The epistemology, the how do we know what is true? And he got involved in those debates of his day with science and so on. I didn't realize he'd been trained as a medical doctor, and that was part of his tendency to talk about science the way he did and how we know what we know. And then also his statements about the state of nature, because that expression also is used by Hobbes. But Reilly makes it very clear that Locke's state of nature is very different from Hobbes, that there is moral law there, that it is social and so on. And then also the idea of happiness could be interpreted to mean, pleasure is happiness and pain is unhappiness, and that's hedonism and so on. But I think Reilly does a fantastic job of, with each of these sort of problem areas with Locke, he brings out, I think, a better, more comprehensive understanding of the complexity of the man and the danger of reading him too simplistically or too narrowly in like a school of Hobbes kind of way. And once you free Locke from Hobbes, then you free the founding from Hobbes as well. And I think that's what Reilly has done.
And if perhaps, one thing we could do here is to free Locke from the modern hedonistic heathens as well, and the radical relativists and the woke people. Because look at this quote on 245 that Reilly gives us by Locke, basically about what is happiness.
Yes.
So that indented quote. To him, I say, who had the prospect of different state of perfect happiness or misery that attends all men after this life, depending on their behavior here, the measures of good and evil that govern his choice are mightily changed. For since nothing of pleasure or pain in this life can bear any proportion to the endless happiness or exquisite misery of an immortal soul hereafter, actions in his power will have their preference, not according to the transient pleasure or pain that accompanies or follows them here, but as they serve to secure that perfect, durable happiness thereafter.
I mean, very few homilists could compete with that. It's a beautiful statement of our purpose in life, right?
It's true.
Absolutely.
It's true.
Yeah.
And the description of his death, having the Psalms read to him aloud as he lay dying, and you realize, I think it can be said with some confidence that he was a believing Christian, and that this cannot be separated from his ideas on what is man and what is the best form of government. And because, as you've said, Joseph, everything flows from that.
Well, and especially since he said those very things himself, that you can't have government without morals, you can't have morals without God, and so on. Joseph, Vivian and I are part of what we call the Acquisitions Committee here at Ignatius Press. And every month we meet and discuss manuscripts. And one of the things that all of us like is a manuscript where we learn something, where some author has gone in to do research and so on and brought it all together, and we see things we didn't know before. And this book really typifies that for me. It's a book you really learn from reading.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I'm so enlightened in the correct sense of that word by reading this book.
And what great timing for the book you're working on, Joseph, which I can't wait
actually,
to read.
I have, as I said in a previous discussion, I'm already borrowing liberally from Robert Reilly for my own book. Which would, obviously, I'll give him all due attribution.
Very good. Well, then, can I give the beautiful introduction I gave last week mistakenly to the next chapters we're going to take?
Yes.
We're going to complete our discussion of this book ourselves, followed by a session with Robert Reilly himself. But we'll take the rest of the book, chapter 9, a restorative founding on reason, the idea that the American Revolution was a restoration, the antipodes, the American Revolution versus the French Revolution, to show that we're not the same as what happened in France. And then finally, critiquing the critics, why they go wrong about what was right. So it's fascinating. We had all this preparation now. He's going to bring it all together in the last 3 chapters, and the epilogue too, which is quite interesting. So, thanks everyone for watching and listening. Hope to see you next week, and God bless you all.